already you're documenting some important stuff that there's been a lot of loose ends, and it's such a massive amount of history and all of that, right? So it's not trying to be completist, but at least we can fill in a few things that, like, for example, it wasn't, in terms of the historical record, it wasn't certain, according to this collection of information, that you went to Egypt, and you already answered that one. So I want to come back and we'll hear about that. So let me throw in a few questions, and I'm just delighted just to listen and soak up wherever you want to go and weaving it together. Let me see, first impressions, yeah, maybe just a tiny bit more on first impressions of Sun Ra's sort of music or being, ideas, vibe, the style, just a bit of snapshots as to, like, how was that in the beginning? You?
That's a good question, because it was the most astounding thing. And they talked, it was so interesting because I was from the West Coast, and when we'd go out, like June and Richard and the orchestra, because I was there with so many that are gone, Jackson, Elo, Danny Davis, so many that are Ebah that aren't here anymore. But we'd go into a little restaurant up at Cal, and it was like being with them in the restaurant. It was the center of the world. Nothing else was going on. Just the focus on the conversation and their time together was so different for me from being from the US. And Richard took me once to an interview, and he just, for one thing, they knew I was green, and they really were very protective. Because we lived in Sun Ra's house for a while. We lived in June's house for a while with June and Richard and her family. June gave us singing lessons and taught us the ways more of New York. Cheryl and I, when I say we, it was Cheryl and I, and taught us the ways of New York. Cheryl, at some point, we both went to New Jersey and stayed at Marshall's mother's house with her. And then at another point, Cheryl went to New York and I went to New Jersey. And I stayed, we both stayed a while with Alzo Wright. He was a viola player. And Ruth Wright, who is the one who started the Space Yodel, that was Ruth Wright. And they're still in New Jersey doing music. But we stayed at Alzo's mother's house for a while. And then I stayed in New Jersey, and she went to New York. And then I would go in and out of New Jersey and be with the band. But I do want to tell one story about Egypt. So when we went to Egypt, there was Cheryl, myself, Ruth Wright, and June Tyson. And so we're at the Mina House. And the Mina House was the hotel where Sadat signed a peace treaty. So there were 4 women. We were told not to go out by ourselves. And the taxi cab driver that Richard had hired took the 4 ladies out and made sure that we were protected. But we were sitting on this balcony of the Mina House where you could see the pyramids, right? We're drinking tea because everywhere you went, you drank tea. It was beautiful mint tea. And at 12 noon, the sun came over the pyramids like this. And when it hit the top of the pyramids, first, the Arabs took the limestone that covered the pyramids and they put it on their mosque, but they couldn't get up to the apex. So when the sun hit the pyramids, the apex lit up like the sun, light being reflected in the mirror, flame. It was the most incredible. And we're sitting there drinking our tea and watching this thing. And then we were studying Egypt. I read a book so this thick on Egypt because Sun Ra's one of his, the motif was Egypt and outer space. And just sitting there looking at this flame and then imagining the processions that the pharaohs had at 12 noon with these 3 pyramids lighting up, and it was just spectacular. We also went inside the tombs. When we went to Egypt, Sun Ra had a letter from the Minister of Arts, and we just followed like birds are following the head of the flock. And this little guy came out, it was after, I think it was the 6-day war. This guy came out with a tattered coat on and an old style rifle at us. And then Sun Ra gave him the papers and he let us pass. And there was no protection around the Sphinx. It was open. And so we get to the Sphinx. This is how big we were at the toenails of the Sphinx. And then we got up on top of the paws of the Sphinx. We danced. We did some videos there, but it was espectacular. So I try to share that story with as many people, with my students, with anybody I come in contact with, and then reading the history of Egypt. And this United States has pretty much taken Egypt out of Africa as Northeast Africa, and the North and the South kingdoms and all of that. Anyway, that was a really spectacular moment for all of us, and for the ladies in particular, because we shared that time together.
Wow, thank you so much. I can barely imagine. I'm imagining, and I'm getting the idea. So just to back up, maybe one thing is, because you mentioned Cheryl a few times, and I didn't think, but I would love to hear just a little bit about her and how you connected with her. And it sounded like you guys really were together quite a bit, and then also Ruth, and maybe just a quick story on that kind of constellation of dance and voice and you gals together.
Cheryl was not with the original three ladies. I think it was 3 or 4 of us that De Leon had introduced to dance with Sun Ra. And I don't remember exactly. I don't think she was on the Greek theater tour. I remember her kind of when she came on the scene, but I can't tell you exactly when it was. But at any point when we got ready to leave, she was hooked up with John Gilmore. And eventually I became very close and hooked up with Marshall, who protected me. That man, but I didn't know, I was so dumb. But we're traveling with a 20-piece orchestra from time to time and being dumb from California. But the Lord protected us, even in our naivete. Anyway, so then I met Cheryl, and because she was hooked up with John Gilmore, the orchestra, I was supposed to go out with the orchestra when they finally left that 6-month residency. I was supposed to go with them back to New York, but for some reason, Cheryl couldn't go, so Sun Ra had me wait until she went, and then we went together, and we stayed at June's house before we actually started the tour. So we got to know each other on the road, and we got to learn, again, Sun Ra teaching us when to do a solo, when to come in. It wasn't about trying to play better than someone else. I remember being backstage and I'm like, okay, Cheryl went out. I'm gonna do what I do. I have to do what I feel. This is not a competition. And these things were taught in silence, just in the music. She had her style of dancing, I had mine, but because of the way Sun Ra trained us in the music, we developed a style through the music. And then when I got more training, when I left and came back, and I had more of a ballet background, just in terms of control and another way of approaching the music, but I still had the jazz and the African. He allowed us to develop our own style, just as the musicians were allowed to develop their style. I heard the guys talking about, he knows where we're at. And he'd tell people to come in and take a solo. And it was all just a glance, which was again, us being birds in a flock and looking at the leader, because you never knew when he was going to tell you to take a solo. And so Cheryl and I also, June was our mentor, because we took the whole Egyptian thing with the arms and everything from June, because she had been there before us. So there was a lot of respect for June. And then she was giving us music lessons, and she gave us the opportunity to stay at our house and stay at her house and teach us somewhat about New York through observation. And just June was such a loving, never met anybody like June. One of a kind. And Richard was a wonderful roadie. So Cheryl and I, we were kind of like 2 baby ducklings in the flock. And John hovered over her and Marshall hovered over me. And then we came together also. So and it was all about the music. It was like everything was pretty much blotted out. Whatever was going on in the world may have been going on, but with us, it was about the music. And we were traveling and we did slugs. I didn't know clubs stayed open till 4 o'clock. So just the adventure in the music and the village and everything in New York was, my God, educational, soul-filling. The mentality of New York is so wonderful. From me coming from the West Coast, and the African Americans in New York in a whole nother headspace than those in the West Coast. It was just so many lessons on so many levels. And I told you I met Susan Pearlstein, in the bathroom at the Bowie Gardens in San Francisco. I didn't know she knew June, but I left in, I think it was 78. I came home to the Bay Area. And I left, it's like I did about a 7-year length of time, pretty continual. And then when I came home, Sun Ra would take me out on the summer because I was teaching. So when they did summer tours, I would still go out with them. And that was like, I think over a 20-year period. But anyhow, they had come back to San Francisco in the Bowie Gardens. June and I were changing in the bathroom, and here comes someone named Sue. And June introduced me, and after that, we were friends.
Yeah.
One of my best buds. At some point, she was the roadie or manager at some point in the band. When Sun Ra passed and John Gilmore took over, the slant of the band was more big band when Marshall came in and took it out into outer space. Not saying not to take anything from John, because John was such a gentle soul everywhere he went. Some of the dancers that I've seen since, because they weren't tutored by Sun Ra, and they may be fantastic dancers, but you have to sit back and listen to the music and understand that the audience, number one, is only going to see you for so long, because the mind spaces everything out. Unless you're doing something totally new every second that you're out there, nobody sees you. So it's really just like the musicians taking a solo. Everybody's playing together, there's harmony, blah, blah, blah. The rhythm and everything is going on. And I give kudos to Tara Middleton, who really, I feel like, embodies the soul of June and that voice, and also the cosmo drama. She brings the cosmo drama back. But my point was, unless you have something new to do every minute, as a dancer, you're just an instrument, which is not, when I say just, I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but you are part of the group. And it's important to know when we can come in and add something, and when we sit out and we're supporting. It's not about ego. It's not about I am. It's about we are in this moment, because every moment is different. Every second is different. I'm just blessed to have had that experience.
Amazing. I'm feeling blessed just to know you now and to be hearing all of this, and so many questions coming up even off of the kind of chart that I made. So you were talking about dance as instrument, and then I had thought about just before in terms of the dancers and singers in with the group of instrumentalists, and also in terms of the rehearsals. Maybe I'll weave a few questions. Let's see how this comes out. In terms of, especially when you were at the staying at the house, let's say. Now, I've been at the house a bit, it's been a while, but I know that room, especially when it's full of musicians, not probably a lot of room for dancers. So that's one thing, is space as a place takes on another meaning probably there. So that's one thing. And then in terms of the rehearsals, like the kind of legendary, you called it whatever, hour in the morning or night or whatever, did you guys, I'm guessing that it was more about getting, let's say, the horn charts or whatever together, but maybe not. Were you, as a dancer and singer, also really involved in these kind of rehearsals?
We did go to some rehearsals. And the other thing is, sometimes we played in clubs that were really small. And so our space to dance in was small. So we had to learn how to, and the music is moving. So we had to learn how to, and we'd be almost touching one another, but not to, and turn, and all these things in a very tight space, which we learned pretty well. And we had our capes, we had our wings on. So how do you maneuver all of that? But a lot of it was singing. A lot of it was getting the rhythm. We weren't there the entire time that the orchestra was rehearsing, but he would call us. And especially when we lived there, when he was ready when he'd get a thought or he'd get an idea, we were there. If he wanted to teach, I know we did a recording of Space is the Place, and I wasn't a singer, but I somehow learned when to come. I think that's recorded. When to come in, when not to come in. And a lot of it, again, was intuition. You really had to be in tune with Sun Ra. Which means you had to let go of yourself. Because it was about the music. And what a difference there would be in humanity if people learned to let go of themselves And if you think of the music as the greater good, and to get in tune with what the greater good is. And that, in that case, and still is the music. And what Marshall has done in terms of just keeping that, just the music alive. And when we were there and when we went to Oregon in, I think it was June, was it June? Whenever they were in Oregon, then the new pieces that he had to replace some of the people who had passed away. Perfect, they were on it. The harmonies, the coming together, in and out solos. It was just, it was food for the soul, food for the spirit. I shouldn't say food, water, because we need water to live. So it was all of that. And then again, Tara with the space. She really, when I first heard her, I think it was in 2014 when we made that tour, just the embodiment of just the sound that she had that reminded me of June was, and June played the violin. And guess, do you know how June ended up playing the violin?
I don't remember.
We were at a concert one day and Sun Ra handed her a violin. And that was it. And she was kind of improvising, but then she went and took lessons. And by the time it was all over, she was playing some gigs on a little coffee shop and whatnot. So and the fact that Tara plays the violin and sings is just amazing to me.
Incredible.
And the embodiment of the drama that goes with that.
And she can go into the cosmo drama, like you were saying. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's just, it's a miracle. Yeah. Okay. There was another question. I was just wondering if this ever came up. I guess you're aware at this point of long before you came along, Sun had worked a lot with dancers and singers too. So I'm just curious if that sort of was in the mix in terms of conversation or how it came out in terms of his sort of guiding you in any ways.
No, I remember there was a very well-known African-American dancer. I cannot remember his name. He had a dance company. And we just were in awe of him. The fact that we were sharing the time with him. And they knew him before. They knew Sun Ra before we did. So everything was mutual respect. But pretty much people like this man, we held in just awe of what he did. And then also though, with Sun Ra allowing the fellas that, like Raymond Sawyer, he also danced. And I saw something of him and there was something on, I don't know if it was, anyhow, it was on Facebook or YouTube with Raymond Sawyer, who was from the East Coast. And this man, fabulous. And Sun Ra took him on the road. I think that was also the first tour we did. And another guy named Doug. But it's interesting. I don't remember any competition between the dancers. We were all waiting for the time that we would go out and what we would do when we go out. Or if I had a thought, because I was in theater also, I did mime sometimes. I went out with a mime face. And one of the dancers, Danny Davis, told me I'm the one that brought the robot in because I had learned how to do the mechanical, how to do all this in mime as part of my theatrical training. So sometimes I do.
That was in the movie, The Space is the Place. Right?
Yeah, in Space is the Place. But there were times when I'd come out with the whole white face. And also because I was in theater, I'd bring a prop. So I might have a fan and the fan would help me do something. So all kinds of different props that would come out. One time he was in San Francisco and I had left, I always danced when they came out. And Sun Ra had some shoes that were like, I think they were red and blue. I picked the shoe up and I started dancing. And a friend of mine was in the audience, but it was just spontaneous. And again, Cheryl and I were there together for a long time, but we both developed our own style. And yet we could, just like the fellows with the harmony, we could come in and play together and then sit out the solo. And pretty much by intuition, that's what Sun Ra would say.
Maybe before, but especially in Chicago, like he worked in the ballrooms, but also in the clubs, the burlesque houses and whatnot. And he worked with dancers in a variety of settings, let's say. And so he knew how to interact and in terms of the steps and whatever moves, and obviously singers too, in terms of the origins of doo-wop and beyond. He had done a lot of stuff with singers at that point. Okay, wow, incredible. So I wasn't aware, like I said, that you had already been in it for quite a few years, a handful of years before going over to Europe, but I'm already blown away. And then that you went to Egypt too, like I can barely imagine, like you guys, your minds and hearts were just blown.
We were part of the orchestra. It wasn't about separating the dance from the music. And the dancers that I saw from New York, they just had this understanding. So nobody really stayed pretty much on the stage the whole time. We did, like with June, we'd have a chair. And sometimes we'd sit right on the stage as though, let's say our feet were our instrument. And so we'd sit on the stage, and when the time hit, we'd get up. If Sun Ra looked at us, we'd get up.
Okay, so I guess I'll try to jump on the timeline slightly here. And I only got so far in terms of when I went and looked up the dates again that were listed for you. So really focused on that end of 71 period and then just moving ahead of that. But in that, what were your impressions in Europe in terms of how were you received, and how did you receive like this sort of cultural experience?
I had a thought, where did it go? Having not really traveled anywhere outside of Utah, and then going straight to New York, and then going to Sweden, the first thing I saw was the audience loved Sun Ra. They were wonderful. Everywhere we went, they loved him. We did one gig in Nice. It was a jazz festival. And Jerry Lee Lewis was on the same set. And what was true about the French audience was if they did not like you, they were not just vocal, they threw things. And so we're watching this man have to run off the stage, compassion. And we're also thinking, you know what, what's gonna happen? Sun Ra, of course, he didn't have those thoughts. I'm the green one. So we're like, wow, this is really amazing. And so we go on stage, the audience loved it. And all of a sudden, here comes a dog out of nowhere. And he comes up and he sits on the stage. The horns surround him and serenade this dog who's like asleep on the stage in the music. But he was very well received. It was just, we're the green ones. I was the green one. And just to see him, especially after seeing the French throw things and be very vocal about what they liked. We went to one gig and they had barricades up. They had these metal cross things to keep the audience, because if the audience didn't like you, they'd rush on the stage. I can't remember if that was Spain or France, one of the two of them, but we didn't have that issue. They loved him. Everywhere Sun Ra went, there's nowhere that I can remember that he was not well received. And for me, it was just when I went to Sweden, because I hadn't been outside the US, I was like, wow, the people were so pale living in this country where it was really cold. Nice, friendly. And the same thing with Finland. And then we go to France, and all of a sudden I'm seeing more light in the people's faces. It was just an education, just traveling. And when I say light, I mean in the skin tone, just a brightness that wasn't in the other, which I presume was the climate and whatnot. And one of Salou was our road manager in Paris, such a lovely man. Salou and Gabby. Salou put us up in the most number A hotels, and he rode with us on the buses, and just a very loving man. And then we did a tour. I think we did one night stands in a tour bus, and that was amazing. But we did it. I did learn that I don't use the word can't. I taught my students never to say you can't. You haven't figured it out yet, but you can and you will. And language was very important, the way we spoke. Being positive, not speaking any kind of destruction or negativity within the group was part of the philosophy of Sun Ra.
I think I want to just hear about that leading up to Egypt, right? Because some people went home. I'm just curious whatever you like to share and what you recall in terms of, there was something with the Danish promoters, right? And then there were tickets that were gotten because there was some tapes that were edited real quick and stuff. I don't know if you saw any of that, but I don't know, whatever you recall in terms of, not everybody ended up in Egypt, but you managed to keep with it.
I know the dancers all went to Egypt. And what I'm not sure about, I know there was a mix-up when we went to Mexico City. That was drama.
That's later, but we'll come to that.
Yeah, no, that's later. I know that's later, but when you said a mix-up with the tickets, that it's something back here, but I can't,
okay.
I'm not specific. I do want to say one thing. When we went to Egypt, Egypt had a theater called the Balloon Theater, and we went there on vacation. Nobody knew we were going. We went from Copenhagen. We had played in Copenhagen, and all of a sudden we find out we're going on vacation. Took a ferry to Egypt, and as again the beautiful hotel. And the waiters in the hotel told us what tribes we came from. It was really amazing. They said, your people are from the Sudan. It was all, wow, just by looking at us. But anyhow, they had a theater called the Balloon Theater, and the Balloon Theater canceled their show so that Sun Ra could perform. And I'm sure that was Sun Ra and Richard in the mix. And
Hartmut, right, who just passed not too long ago. Hartmut Gierken had arranged that stuff as well.
Maybe I was new, so I was more in touch with Richard and the inner workings of Sun Ra, and Abe also. Abe sent me a sewing machine because I was making costumes for Sun Ra by hand. My mother was a seamstress and had learned tailoring, so that's how I came into that. But he sent me a sewing machine once. And then I was making costumes, and I also made suits for Marshall.
Amazing. So the sewing machine came along on the road. You were doing it?
I was in New Jersey, but when I went to New Jersey, Sun Ra, when he found out, I made him this, I think the first one was the blue velvet with black trim, and that had the appliques of space on it. But when he found out I could sew, we were at June's one day, and he sent both of this purple velvet velour fabric, and we all had the assignment of making these plates with Saturns on them. So the whole band, and we women were in Space Cadets, let's put it there, were in June's apartment sewing them by hand. But interesting journey.
Amazing. There was just, what came to mind is this poem of Sun Ra's, I forgot the title exactly, but it's with the line, "What you reap, you." Remember this one? When he's like spelling it out, his
literally.